Are you familiar with the term Oscar bait? It's a term used by film aficionados to refer to movies that appear to have been produced simply to appeal to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in order to secure as many Academy Awards, or Oscars, as possible. Aside from trying to fulfill only the minimum eligibility requirements to be nominated for an Academy Award in the first place, they are usually also criticized for supposedly pandering to the biases of the Academy voters. I can't really comment on how true this is, and I obviously also can't call Gris award bait because there's no equivalence to the Academy Awards for video games. Unless, of course, you want to honestly claim that the Game Awards, that commercial in the guise of an awards show, counts. But if you seriously think anything the Dorito Pope touches has enough clout to be considered an honor, you're beyond hopeless. But even if there's no real Oscar baiting in gaming going on, Gris still somehow feels purposely made to be considered an indie darling. Simple mechanics propped up with artsy visuals and what critics usually call an evocative soundtrack, coupled with a vague narrative about a serious theme. Now, I obviously can't peek inside the creators' heads to know that this was their intention, and I feel uncomfortable in going so far as to asserting some kind of motivation behind making Gris. But the way it plays and what parts of itself it chooses to focus on all tell me that Gris was first and foremost not made to express anything particular through its gameplay. On its surface, Gris is a platformer, and that's pretty much it. It has a few puzzles in there, but I'd be hesitant to call it a puzzle platformer because they're largely not the point of the game. It also has some Metroidvania influence, but again, I'd hardly call it a proper Metroidvania because there's not much of a point in going back to previous sections unless you desperately want to find all the collectibles. No, Gris is what I envision when I hear the word platformer as a standalone description for a game. There are no enemies that can harm you, no pits or spikes that act as instant death dispensers, and nothing that can stop you from progressing. It's just a girl walking, swimming, and jumping around some levels. For the most part, at least. I'd say a large portion of the first half of the game is purely just pushing forward without much thought required by the player, until you get your first power-up. But even then, it never really goes beyond very minimal use of those powers in interesting ways. For example, one power-up lets you turn into a block, which only gets used either in simplistic switch puzzles or that one stretch through the desert where the wind blows you around and you have to turn into a block to not get blown backwards. And of course, sometimes there's a cracked bit of floor below you that you can break by turning into a block in midair. But honestly, I wouldn't even count that as a puzzle because it usually only happens at a dead end and it's not like it's hard to notice. So it's basically a non-obstacle that's just put in your way because a game can't just be about walking through some pretty scenery. Though there are a bunch of walking simulators who would contest that notion, but I digress. To me, the game only really came alive as a gameplay experience towards the end when I headed up the stairs into the sky level. There were some neat platforming ideas in there, and all of the possible gameplay interactions had to be used to navigate the space. Though the gravity shifting mechanic is so old that the first Newgrounds game that implemented it can probably legally drive at this point. And it's not like I'm just dunking on it because it's an old mechanic. Platforming itself is probably one of the oldest mechanics out there, but the shifting gravity mechanic just comes out of nowhere and doesn't seem to be all that well integrated with the rest of the mechanics. Honestly, to me the gameplay in this game was just not substantial enough to be all that engaging. I get wanting to make a chill platformer that allows for some time to breathe and contemplate your surroundings, but at the end of the day, I personally play video games to experience gameplay that I enjoy. And I can't say that I enjoyed the platforming or simplistic puzzles in Gris a lot. And while the game has certain leanings towards Metroidvanias, they're not all that fleshed out. There are a few secrets you can find in there that unlock an alternate ending, but the fact that going back to already solved sections seemingly isn't encouraged and many of the sections feature obvious points of no return makes satisfying exploration in order to find all these secrets without needless trial and error kind of frustrating. It also doesn't help that the game sometimes gives almost no indication on how to solve any given quote-unquote puzzle. Take for example this mirrored temple room, where your obvious path forward is to swim through the inverted temple and move on. But there's a collectible on top of the regular temple. When you look at this in isolation, you'll probably think to yourself that maybe you're supposed to jump out of the water somewhere in order to platform your way up there. But no, the actual solution is to swim further to gather these hidden triangle-shaped creatures. They allow you to jump out of the water and perform a double jump to get higher. After that, you have to swim around the entire structure and use that double jump to make this leap of faith to this bit of water that floats under the ceiling of the cave for some reason. And you can't even see that water from where you're supposed to make that jump. Once you're up there, you can just drop onto the collectible in question. This is just such roundabout puzzle design, and the fact that I missed a few of those collectibles that were probably hidden or reachable in a similar roundabout manner didn't really encourage me to go back and complete the collectathon. Now, I mentioned the pretty scenery a few minutes ago, and I have to admit the game boasts a striking watercolor aesthetic. I like how the game starts out very monochromatic and gains more colors as you progress through the game. It ties very nicely into the theme of the game, which is about overcoming grief. If you've lost a loved one at some point in your life, you can probably relate to this feeling that everything seems grey and empty and that moving on with your life may seem pointless. But doing so reveals to you bit by bit that life is still worth living. This theme is wonderfully explored by the visuals and the progression through the game. And while the music is at times a bit cynically dripping with pathos to evoke a certain mood and atmosphere, coupled together with some beautiful animation work, it becomes shockingly effective. Probably my favorite bit in the game was when you briefly befriend this little creature that follows you around and mimics your actions. It shows that going out and building new bridges can immediately make this lonely and otherwise empty representation of grief seem bright and cheerful. And it's actually the only point of the game where the gameplay itself plays part in what the game intends to convey. Similarly, the quote-unquote boss fights against these black creatures certainly manage to represent the many tripping hazards on your way to overcome grief that can immediately suck you back down again. It's just a shame that the gameplay does absolutely nothing to reinforce this. I mean, this black underwater eel section clearly wants to make you feel like you're desperately trying to get away from it, but it's a section you literally can't lose. So the gravity of the situation and the metaphor of overcoming this adversity immediately flies out of the window because it's an entirely scripted sequence that doesn't rely on any of your input. And that's pretty much the biggest failing of Gris. It's that its gameplay doesn't reinforce its themes and narrative in the slightest. It's just a basic, simplistic platformer with a few token abilities that allow for equally token quote-unquote puzzles to be sprinkled in. Honestly, the game doesn't really benefit from being interactive at all. It could have just been a piece of animation watched on your TV and it would be exactly as effective at conveying its themes as it is with its interactivity. I'd argue it would be even more effective because the simplistic gameplay actually detracts from it. I mean, this is a game about grief and depression and about overcoming it. What would be better than to make the player overcome it by giving them an actual challenge to overcome? You had the potential right there in front of you and you failed to realize it. I can't outright say that I don't recommend playing Gris. While the gameplay is really nothing to write home about, I can certainly see how a more relaxed gameplay experience can also be enjoyable. And if you want to immerse yourself in a pretty world set to pretty music with some relaxing, easy gameplay that doesn't tax your reflexes or your logic skills all that much, I guess Gris is easy to recommend. But to me, it only achieves half of what I think it sets out to do, and that's unfortunate.